Okay, after stretch break or whatever there, we'll focus in on faith and science considerations. There we go. A lot of times the difficulty is because science has been claimed to support a particular moral position, which conflicts with traditional, typically religious, moral positions. But again, science doesn't really tell us the answer to a moral question. There are a number of errors that we tend to see associated with those types of claims. For example, in the Bible, we have the verse from Proverbs telling the lazy person to consider the ant and be wise. Okay, well, let's consider ants. What do you know about ants? Probably a variety of things. You may know that they are rather strong for their size. They work hard. They raid picnics. Some of them sting. Most of them live in holes in the ground. They carry things with their mouths and use all their limbs for walking. Lots of things you might know about an ant. Okay. Which of those are things that we should do? Not all of them. Working hard, yeah, that's good. Working mindlessly, that's not good. Kidnapping somebody else's babies and raising them as slaves, no, that's not a good example. Yes, there are ants that do that. Crawl around and carry stuff with their mouths, well, that's just silly. Pick up things much heavier than ourselves, well, we can't do that. What's actually a good example for us or not? Well, we need to already know that, yeah, I'm being kind of lazy. I ought to work more than the ant's useful reminder, but just the, oh, what does an ant do? Okay, I'll do that. No, that doesn't work. This science, the observing the ants, doesn't tell us what to do, but we can use as a reminder if we do know what's right and wrong. Claiming that science shows that something's morally correct, there are a number of basic problems there. One, you're making some philosophical assumptions. It's not just science. And science tends to say, well, if you do this, then this happens. You do that, that happens. Okay, which one? Science isn't telling us go this way, go that way. It just says, well, here's what's going to happen. And even if you make those types of assumptions, often what science says and what somebody wants to claim it does don't match up so well. Claiming that science is a source of moral guidance, well, that's a philosophical claim. It's not science. And also pretty easy to realize that it's got some problems. Law of gravity says things fall down. Does that mean that I should drop things on people? No. It tells us what will happen if you do, but it doesn't say you should, just that's what happens. Now, of course, people don't usually say such silly things about gravity, saying you ought to do something, but they do often try claiming that evolution says you ought to do something. All evolution says is, well, if you got particular genes or behavior, then this either helps or hurts your chances of passing on your genes to future generations. Is this good? Is this bad? It increases or decreases your chances of passing on genes. Doesn't say if it's good or bad. Okay, but if we ignore that and say we're going to get our ideas from science, how do you know what's progress versus going bad? They're both going somewhere, but which way do we want to go? Science isn't telling us that, just what happens. Again, a common sort of error along this line is claiming that evolution is progress in some sort of ethical sense. Now, what happens in evolution? The basic primitive number of fingers or toes for reptiles and mammals is 10 apiece, but quite a few things have lost digits. This tends to go along with being faster runners. So we see this in, say, horses and deer, cows, sheep, dogs, dinosaurs. Snakes have lost a whole limb, not just the digits. Okay, so let's be progressive and cut off some fingers. You can go first. But on the other hand, we have some sorts of things that have extra digits. Plesiosaurs, for example, group of swing reptiles, getting bigger paddles to swim with, having additional digits in there. So to be more advanced, we should grow more fingers and maybe then cut them off. No. More fingers works for some things, fewer works for some things. We do just fine with R5. One's not progress relative to the other. Each one's going its own direction, and if it works for it, then that's great for evolutionarily. And whether it's good or bad, that's not a question that evolution is telling us. Cartoon kind of illustrating this. Science might tell us how to clone T-Rex, but it doesn't directly tell us whether we ought to or not. Again, even if we allow the philosophical problems there, a lot of times you see where somebody's basically just looking for excuses and claims that science supports some position that they want to hold anyway. And when you think about, no, the science doesn't support it. One popular thing is say, well, animals do this, so that must be morally okay for me. Yeah, if you really pay attention to all the things animals do, a lot of them are not real good ideas for humans. For example, study a few years back now was looking at burying beetles. They bury dead things as a source of food, both for the adults and for the young. But they found that for the particular type of burying beetle they looked at any rate, that the parents were more likely to eat their young if the young begged too much. That's not a good role model for humans. You'd think twice about running home for money. No. Just because an animal does something doesn't mean it's a good idea. We found a textbook claiming that evolution shows that we are masters of our own fate. Yeah, just like the dinosaurs getting clobbered by the asteroid. No. Evolution is not being master of your own fate. Now, of course, philosophically, whether we're masters of our own fate or not, well, evolution doesn't tell us that. It just tells us what patterns of passing on genes are and things like that. How stuff is related doesn't tell us if we're masters of our own fate or not. But with well over 90% of species being extinct, that really doesn't sound like being master of your own fate. On the other hand, the problem might not be with science, but it could be understanding other things. So, for example, if we misunderstand the Bible, that might be the source of problems between faith and science as well. Now, what is the Bible about? Well, Westminster Larger Catechism mid-1600s statement. Scriptures principally teach what we're to believe about God and what duties he requires of us. No, the Bible is not primarily about science. And if we need about science, well, go study the world and find out. The Bible does use metaphors, other types of figurative language, everyday language, rather than technical science. Now, where science does come up, yeah, that's accurate, but that's not the focus. It's not necessarily technical precision. We can misinterpret the Bible as well as the physical world. Some examples of things in the Bible that don't quite fit scientifically. Description of the temple furnishings. The round basin, known as the sea, is described as being 10 cubits across and 30 around. Well, geometry tells us if it were precisely 10.00000 cubits across, then, and it were a perfect circle, then it would be 31.4159653587384666433, so forth, cubits around. Mustard seed is not the smallest seed in the world. It's not even the smallest seed that would have been familiar to people at the time there. You have descriptions, metaphors like the wings of the wind or apple of the eye, stuff like that. But none of those are intended as precise mathematical scientific claims. It's not like the Bible is saying pi is 3.0. It's giving a rough size of the basin. Mustard seed is tiny, especially compared to the size of the plant that can grow from it. That's the point, not botanical world records. Things that touch on science in the Bible do hold up. David tells Saul that he's not afraid of Goliath because he's dealt with lions and bears before. Now, if you're in Israel today and want to see a lion or bear, you need to go to a zoo. But going back to biblical times, or even within the past several hundred years in case of lions, a little more recently the bears, they were there. The types of plants and animals and things like that mentioned in the Bible are what was there. And yep, 10 across, 30 around. Well, the one did it. That's perfectly good as pi. So if it says it was 10 across and 40 around, you'd wonder about how good Solomon was making circles if he came up with that. But 10, 30, yeah, that's close enough for the give a rough size of the stuff there. Again, science is limited. As humans, we all have limited knowledge. We have biases, we make mistakes. And science, the tools it has, deal only with physical realities. They don't get to other things. Job 28, for example, looking at impressive human accomplishment, talks about geology, specifically mining and the extent to which people had done things even back then, but gives lots of useful knowledge, but not wisdom in this biblical sense of knowing what to do, trusting and respecting God. What about miracles? Are those contrary to science? Again, science is looking at what happens under ordinary conditions, and that doesn't really address do miracles happen. Of course, if you claim scientism that miracles don't exist, well then you're claiming miracles don't exist, but also what? You claim it, that doesn't make it valid. The biblical picture of miracles is for them to be serving very specific purposes. They don't just kind of happen all over the place. Use fairly restricted. And a situation that includes miracle can also involve some ordinary things happening as well. In thinking about what could you do scientifically with the miracle? Imagine taking a bunch of chemical apparatus in a time machine, go to Cana, and okay, well, yeah, it's water, and now it's wine. What did the chemical apparatus do that the people's tongues that were there didn't already tell you? Not much. You do have some ordinary means involved with miracles. Exodus 14 tells of God sending wind to part the sea. In fact, there's been computer simulation showing that one of the lakes now dug through by the Suez Canal would have been able to part if you had just the right wind on it. Now, it's not as if it's happened every afternoon at 5 when Egypt's born, nobody noticed. This did involve some pretty impressive coordination up there, but in terms of how it was achieved, sending wind, Matthew 17 has the fish having the tax money for Peter and Jesus. Well, yeah, there's a type of fish in the Sea of Galilee that tends to pick up shiny things, but Jesus, knowing that Peter would catch anything, that it was specifically one of those fish that it would be the one carrying exact change. Turning water to wine, but then folks had to do all the work of serving in the ordinary way. So sometimes there may be some physical processes involved relating to the miracle as well as the supernatural. Another area where people often get confused is randomness. What does that mean? Does it mean that God's not involved? Part of the issue is that random has more than one definition in detail, and we need to be sure that we're not mixing those up. Mathematically, random specifically means something that is best described by the laws of probability. For example, rolling a die, flipping a coin, casting lots, radioactive decay, patterns of mutation. There are lots of things where, humanly speaking, the best way that we have to describe them is with a model that uses probabilities. But we also use random rather more broadly to mean anything that couldn't really predict. Say, I was walking across the quad and happened to run into a friend. There's no math formula for that. It's something that wasn't planned. You couldn't predict. Now you've got a chance. Can you know how many people you know and things like that? But it's not something you could be certain of. There are also things that do have a good specific mathematical formula, but it turns out that whether the formula is complicated or the formula is simple, but the results are complicated, it may be something unpredictable. For example, weather. You've noticed, no doubt, that the weather forecast is not 100% correct every time. Well, we have very good formulas of how the weather works. All we need to do is find out what every atom in the air is doing at any one moment and be able to put all that information into a computer that can crunch that much information in order to precisely predict what the weather is going to be doing into the future. Except I just read the move and jumble the atoms again. We have to put that data into our calculation unit. Okay, so obviously we can't just through computing power, say, okay, January 30th of 2025 in Boiling Springs is going to be sunny and a high of 15 Celsius. No, we cannot calculate that far ahead. Now, a few days ahead, you can get pretty good. Further out, the more those uncertainties, things that we can't measure, are going to kick in. We can also, by random, mean something that's purposeless. Random violence doesn't seem to have any point to it. Well, one, what do we mean when we say something's random? Scientifically, we can show that certain things are described well by a probabilistic mathematical formula. There are also things scientifically we can show that, yes, they either don't have any particular pattern, or at least not one that we figured out, or the formula, again, is something that is too complicated in some way to apply. Science can't tell us whether something is random in ultimately is there purpose behind it. Now we can say we do not see purpose in some particular bit that we're considering, but that doesn't mean there might be or might not be some further purpose behind there. And the Bible identifies examples of all three of these as being under God's control. So random in any of these senses doesn't mean that God's not in control, it just means we can't predict it. So for example, I roll a die. Well, I know it's going to be 1 through 6 if it's a six-sided die. But which one? I don't know. Could God know? Sure. I do something I didn't have any purpose. Could God have a purpose for it? Sure. Describing things as random from our perspective doesn't tell us one thing or another about God's perspective on it. Another area where there is quite a lot of misinformation is on the history of science and faith, how things have interacted. A popular wrong perception is a constant warfare of science and religion. That's roughly paraphrasing the title of a rather notorious book from the late 1800s. In reality, history is complicated. Lots of things are going on in any one situation, and you need to take a look at that and also recognize that people in the past had ideas in keeping with the way people were thinking then, which was somewhat different from now. Assuming that somebody fits into a modern category based on some particular aspect of their thinking is probably not correct. For example, Galileo, quite popularly mentioned. It is quite true that Galileo got in trouble with the Roman Catholic authorities, but there were multiple things going on there. For one thing, yes, Galileo was advocating the Earth going around the sun, and the Roman Catholic authorities were not keen on that idea, in part because not too long before this, Bruno was promoting all sorts of weird ideas and heresies, and also said that the Earth was going around the sun. That didn't help the idea. Also, scientifically, it was not clear. Did the Earth go around the sun or sun go around the Earth? Galileo, one of his big arguments, was wrong. So there was legitimate uncertainty on the question. And in fact, a lot of those particularly prominent and opposing Galileo, had recognized that the old everything goes around the Earth model of Ptolemy didn't work so well. But Tycho Brahe, a prominent astronomer of the generation before Galileo, had pointed out that you can have the sun and moon go around the Earth and the other planets go around the sun, and that would fit with the way things appear as well. And so they had made some adjustments based on evidence. Also, other things going on with Galileo. In promoting heliocentrism, Galileo wrote a book. Basic plot, you've got two fellows arguing. One's arguing for heliocentrism, the other geocentrism, Earth going around the sun or sun going around the Earth. And a third fellow comes along and listens to the arguments. And Galileo wrote the book, so of course it's the fellow arguing for heliocentrism that the arguments went out in the book. Two problems here. One, when Galileo had first been admonished relating to heliocentrism, he'd been told you can discuss the idea, talk about being an interesting idea, but can't say this is the correct idea. The book was kind of pushing the envelope on that, so that got some trouble in terms of not doing what he'd been told to do there. Other thing is, not too surprisingly, since Galileo wrote the book, the fellow arguing for the sun going on the Earth does not come off as being very smart. That same stupid fellow does quite a lot of directly quoting the Pope. Not the best way to make the Pope happy with you. Galileo could have been a lot more tactful. Now, he wasn't nearly as bad as Bruno on that, but Galileo could have done a better job of trying to keep folks happy. Also, Galileo got some of the scientists of his day unhappy for challenging Aristotelian physics. This also didn't entirely go over well with the Roman Catholic authorities. Renaissance. Western Europe is getting more of the writings from classical Greek and Rome, and a lot of folks are so excited about those that they tend to ignore all the corrections that have been developed during medieval times. So folks who are a big fan of Aristotle didn't like this, and the church had pretty strongly endorsed Aristotelian ideas. So they behind, for example, the logic going into transubstantiation, the Roman Catholic doctrine of what happens in the course of communion. And of course, Galileo, this is in the time frame, Reformation is getting going. The Roman Catholic Church isn't going to be too happy with anybody who's challenging things relating to the Roman Catholic position where the Protestants are disagreeing. So you've got all these going on contributing to the situation for Galileo. Similar idea, the claim that people thought the Earth was flat, and then Columbus was proving that wrong. No. Anybody who was educated in medieval Europe was aware of the Earth being round. They didn't have stupid YouTube videos to mislead them. So. Now, of course, who knows what the average peasant thought? Nobody asked him. But those who were educated were aware of the Earth being round. Now, whether there was a point in going the way Columbus proposed, that would have been open to question, but Columbus wasn't showing that the Earth was round. That was made up by Washington Irving. The Neil there, vaccination. the earliest form of vaccination present in Western Europe. You had similar stuff actually rather earlier than that, getting more into the Mideast and beyond, but it was Jenner's development of inoculation with cowpox as a preventative for smallpox. And so word of this idea made it across from England, 1700s, to the New World, and folks in the colonies figure out what to do with this. The Puritan authorities in New England decided this was a good idea. They promoted vaccination. More skeptical type folks, such as Ben Franklin's older brother Richard, tended to be more dismissive of the idea. So Richard disparaged vaccination in his newspaper. The Puritan authorities did not approve of this and told him that he was not allowed to publish for something like a month or so. Well, what Richard did was take out Richard and write in Benjamin in the space as to who was supposedly publishing the paper, and kept right on printing. Suppose that followed the letter of the law, but certainly not the spirit of it. If we look at prominent figures in church history, we can see such as Calvin in Reformation, or Augustine back in early church, criticizing misusing scripture to justify bad science or criticize good science. Point out that science is looking at things a different way. If our interpretation of scripture seems to clash with science, then we need to look at the interpretation as well as at the science. Again, historical claims, often not too accurate. And scientists, well, focused on science, often don't know much about the history behind it. Another example of a claim, not too hard to figure out when you think about it, it's not a good one. You see the assertion that medieval people were opposed to heliocentrism because they wanted mankind to be in the center of the universe. The universe doesn't order on me. Say it isn't so. But if you think a bit about that traditional imagery, would you rather go down there or up there after you die? The center is not a good place to be. Heliocentrism promoted the Earth into the heavens. It was not a demotion from being in the center. Now, it is true that a lot of people weren't too keen on the idea of heliocentrism early on, but it wasn't because they were too proud to admit they weren't in the center of things. One source may be of interest if you're particularly into history sorts of things. There's a blog titled History for Atheists, actually written by an atheist who would like to see his fellow atheists do a better job and use better arguments than a lot of them out there. And it goes through a lot of the popular supposed warfare of faith and science things and gives historical accuracy there. Another point where you often see arguing is timing method of creation. Particularly, you see the claim that the Bible calls for a calendar day, 1 week recent creation. Certainly, Genesis 1 through the beginning of chapter 2 does have a series of 7 days there. But that word can refer to varying periods of time. including more figuratively. It's actually true in English as well. Day, we can talk about what day is it? Well, let's see, it is the 27th of July. Happens to be when I'm recording this lecture. But also, we can say, well, I look out the window and it's light out there. It is day, it is not night. That's a different sense of day. But we also use day more broadly. We might say, back in Jesus' day, Rome ruled the Mediterranean. In that sense, we're using day rather indefinitely as a time period. And same in Hebrew, yom, that can refer to a day of the calendar. It can refer to day being not night. It can refer to a more indefinite period. And even within Genesis 1 and 2, we see those three, at least definitely two, perhaps three of those there. Genesis 2:4, it's not always obvious in some English translations, but there's a reference to one day that seems to cover all of creation, including that sequence of 6 days and then the day of rest from Genesis 1. And following in that description of one day, you have aspects that would take more than one single 24-hour day. Again, the point of the Bible is not to give us science or even a modern style, just the facts history. It's mainly trying to tell us things theologically. That doesn't mean that it's wrong about history science, but it's selective. It's only telling us those aspects of the history that are relevant to illustrate the theological point. It's not a complete history. It's not modern science. Looking more closely at the tales, the exact style of Genesis 1, we don't have anything else from the Bible or from what we know of other ancient Near Eastern writing that precisely matches it. So we can't go to something else directly and say this must be what it means. We do have a number of other ancient Near Eastern texts that use a sequence of making something in 7 days as a picture of perfect completion, 7 being symbolic of perfection culturally. We still have a little bit of that, of 7 kind of often being perceived as kind of lucky, or conversely, we could see how a lot of people would not think creation in 13 days sounds good. So there's definitely number symbolism involved here. The grammar also is a little bit funny in terms of what you'd normally use for an ordinary day. It doesn't, in Hebrew, actually say the first day, day 1, and a second day, a third day. Day 7 is the only one that has a complete, clear, the 7th day. Wording with day 6 is a little bit ambiguous how you interpret that. So that's, again, not how you'd usually just say things if you were talking about calendar days. A lot of different interpretations have been proposed over the years in the church. God's powerful one, it's instant creation. A series of days, but long intervals between them. Or day age, where each of those days is a long time period. Gap idea, where God created, like in Genesis 1, verse 1. And then this envisions a long gap of time skipped over, and then the detailed accounts of creation in Genesis 1, 2 describing a recreation after some sort of catastrophic event that kind of clears things out. Another suggestion, days of proclamation, where God makes a series of proclamations in 7 days, and then actually implementing the proclamations takes longer. Or vision days, that God gives Moses basically a vision of creation over 7 days and summarizes his impressions. The interpreting the 7 days as a literary device, again picturing completion, not intended to talk about time by Moses with the original writing. A lot of different interpretations exist within the church. And not that you have to follow one of those, but being aware of the possibilities, think about them. Basically, you're getting the errors in the one direction of here's a scientific explanation, so that takes out a picture, or God was in the picture, so science can't explain it. Well, no. God being involved doesn't mean we couldn't possibly have a scientific explanation. We might not. It's two separate questions. Okay, so that wraps up our first bit here. We'll next move into focus on oceanography itself.